It came really fast, the Corbyn moment, we had to build for it and it didn't happen. But if that were to ever happen again, we would need a really solid, organised base of people who were organised in their workplaces and their communities to support a moment like that.
Your colleagues might have views you really disagree with, but if we want to transform the world, loads of people along the way we're going to have arguments with, right? And it's about like, how do we have those arguments in ways that bring people with us?
We articulate the same argument again and again. You know, let's stop putting the onus on individuals. Let's put it on corporations, on companies who are actually polluting the planet. But then there's a missing bit in that argument. You're like, okay, and then what? Like, how are we going to make these companies do what we want them to do?
Hi, I'm Ben Smoke and welcome to Troublemaking, a series from Versco based on the book Troublemaking by Lydia Hughes and Jamie Woodcock, in which we'll be talking about organising in your workplaces. We'll be visiting some of the stories and the people within the book and looking at how you can get involved in the trade union movement and the struggle for liberation of the working class. Today, this is our final episode, episode 3. I am joined by Jamie Woodcock and Lydia Hughes, who wrote the book. I don't know if I already mentioned that, didn't I? Did you guys write this book?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah? Remember
Can
it?
confirm.
Yeah.
So we spent a little bit of time in the first episode talking about the campaigns to unionise and organise, particularly migrant workers, and the fight against outsourcing. In the second episode, we talked about organising in industries that potentially have not seen organising before, and sort of new frontiers for trade unionism and why that's so important. Obviously, that's just a tiny little bit of what is in the book. I kind of wanted to start by asking, why? Why did you write the book? Why did you put yourselves through it?
Yeah, why did we put ourselves through it? Why the why book? We conceived of the book and started writing it in a really important moment, I think, for the whole British left and also for the left in the US. It was a moment when the Corbyn movement had been crushed, and the same with Bernie in the US. So we were at this crossroads, total crossroads, where there was a humongous base of activists who had really put their all into the Corbyn movement. And now all of a sudden we're looking around and thinking, what the hell do we do next? Like, our route to socialism, to mass social change had disappeared overnight. And we know so many friends and people that we organise with who all of a sudden were left without any route to change, any mode with which we could actually bring about socialism. So we wrote this book not as a how-to guide, but as a why. Why is trade union organising the basis through which we can achieve socialism?
Yeah, and I don't want this to sound in any way like I'm kind of saying, these young people don't know what they're doing, because like young people do today, right? Like they're doing incredible things. But I guess there was a bit of a thing that had come up, a few times with conversations of people involved in Britain around the Corbyn movement, of not seeing a connection between organising at work and what was happening like in the bigger political kind of arena, and having lots of discussions with people about being like, do your door knocking, do campaigning, but like, where do you work? What's happening in your workplace, and trying to think about a connection between those two things. And I think, everyone was inspired by how many people got involved in bigger politics, right? But there wasn't that base to follow it through. And I think, part of, for us, is about saying like, you don't have to be an expert or a TikTok celebrity or, have a huge following. Well, after this podcast, but as in like, you don't need an expert, you don't need some celebrity. Like, actually, if you want to be part of building a better future, like start by having conversations with your colleagues, start doing those bits. And, for us, it's about that, making that argument that like, we're all part of a movement to change the world. And that means like, your work isn't this like thing that you have to get up for on a Monday morning. I mean, yeah, obviously you have to do that, but it can also be a place where like politics begins, right?
Do you think, in terms of the left and that moment of Corbynism, the 4 years or so, do you think that, we are not a majority in the sense that, we don't have the resources of the majority. And so within that time, it became very much like this was the route to mild social democracy. Like, let's fucking go, boys, because everything that we'd had before, we had the Ed Stone and like Brown and Blair. But in that, do you think some of the kind of fundamentals got lost?
I think so. I really think so. I think when we came out of that Corbyn moment, the reckoning afterwards, there was a general consensus that, it came really fast, the Corbyn moment, we had to build for it and it didn't happen. But if that were to ever happen again, we would need a really solid, organised base of people who were organised in their workplaces, in their communities, to support a moment like that. Or if Corbyn had been elected, hold him to account. Mm-hmm. And that was always our view throughout the Corbyn moment of, if he gets elected, we're going to need to hold him to account. If he doesn't get elected, we're going to need a really strong base of people who are very organised to make the change that we want to see, basically.
I also think there's a bit of a thing with this of like, lots of people got involved in these movements around social democracy because they feel like the society we live in is not democratic, and people want to say in, are we just sleepwalking to destroy the planet and like ruin everything? And you can see there's like lots of people who want to change, like how society runs, but there's just so much of our lives that's not democratic. And I think, there was a bit of an issue, I think, of like those big social democratic kind of campaigns like not connecting to the democracy of the workplace, because like if you speak to most people today, like who aren't in unions, who are working precarious work of some kind, like what kind of democracy do people have in the workplace? It's so limited, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's trying to connect those kind of two, like I guess one's like big P politics, but to say that like politics in the workplace, there's a connection between those. It's just for a lot of people, like, when was the last time people had that experience in the workplace, right?
I guess part of it as well is, as much as holding Corbyn to account would have been very important, also kind of having the like structural integrity of the left to be able to enact the programme. Because obviously we saw, I mean, particularly I think from 2017 onwards, was this sort of, barrage, this like sustained attack from the establishment. And had Corbyn have won in 2019, I think like none of us are naive enough to think that he was just going to sort of wander in. And like I did an interview with him a couple of months ago, and he was talking about how Johnny Mac sort of did all of these war games about how the city would react and how the CBI would react to them coming in and being like, we are nationalising sausages and stuff like that. And so I think like, there's I think a huge lesson to learn is sort of like understanding that actually that winning that election was like was day one, essentially, like getting to that point. And without this sort of fibrous network of democracy and small p politics, we never had a snowball's chance in hell of actually enacting it. And I kind of on that basis I wanted to, because in the book you talk about, loads and loads of different examples. We would be here for hours, but to sort of zoom out a little bit, because we've talked, as I mentioned, we've talked about sort of very specific workplace organising in different sectors and why it's important kind of within those, and then slightly within the trade union movement as a whole. But also, I think what the book does really well, and what I kind of want to pull out a little bit now, is to look at why trade union movements, why trade union organising is so important for a wider struggle. And so, I don't know, it's kind of hard to know where to start. We were just talking about this, and we were talking about how like the history of liberatory struggles has kind of like erased trade unions from it. I wonder if you kind of wanted to pick a place to start, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I think maybe just before we move on to that, I think it segues into it nicely as well. In the book, we're not talking about building the kind of power that can get our favourite social democratic leader elected. I could picked the Corbyn example, but in the book we're advocating for a sort of politics that goes beyond that and that builds socialism from below and hopefully moves past social democracy as well. so we use a lot of examples in the book, and we use the examples because we want to highlight that the current trade unionism that we have, where we talk about pay and conditions and a really limited set of things that we can fight over, which the government has pushed us in that direction, we can campaign and we can organise for some things much larger than that. And that trade unions, if they are strong enough, or if worker organising is strong enough, really there's no limit to what we can demand at all. And one of the examples we use for this is, for example, the South African apartheid solidarity movement, in which loads of trade unions were organised in Britain to boycott South African goods, and to show solidarity with trade unionists in South Africa as well. But I think the Sans Papier movement is the one that really sticks out to me. It's a bit more of a contemporary example. And it shows how workers organising without papers in Paris, mostly in France, were organising through unions and through worker networks to regularise their statuses. So it was a solidarity network built on the idea that you would go from workplace to workplace as a movement, as workers striking, occupying, to encourage employers to regularise the status and give papers to the workers working there. And it's a fantastic example of how we don't have to just be limited to pay and conditions. We want 5% more, 6% more. We can actually demand things so much further beyond that.
Yeah, I think, there's a number of these different examples. And I think the thing that we try to pull out in the book is those kind of moments where people use their power in the workplace to do something more, or to ask for something more. And, I don't want to sound too hackneyed, but for me, it goes back to the Paris Commune, right? Of what does radical democracy that starts from the workplace, what can it look like, right? And in Paris, that looks like, closing the pawnbrokers, giving people their stuff back, stopping landlordism, not having bakers have to work really early in the morning, changing working hours, of if we had a say, what would we want the world to look like? And surprise, nothing like what the world looks like. But it's to try and find those moments of what I don't want to sound like is some kind of a hackneyed lefty being the Paris Commune. But you see these moments come up again and again, right? Of where people aren't, as Lydia says, saying I want 5% more wage, so then my landlord charges me 5% more rent, and we're back to the beginning again. But where people say what could I do about having control in my workplace to say we're not going to stock South African apartheid grown vegetables, or today not have things grown in settlements in Israel, or if we wanted to nationalize an industry, sausages and Greggs, for example, where does that begin, right? It begins with the people that do the work every day in those places. So what we don't want from the book is this idea that politics is only about what happens in your workplace. It's about how you move from that to somewhere bigger and have a bigger imagination, right?
I think it does it quite amazingly, and sort of has that ability. I was sort of, as I've been reading it, thinking, there's so much that we can win. And I think that we talked about it in the last episode, the left is very bad at recognising its achievements, but we're also kind of not told about them, whether that's historical or contemporary. I think one of the things that really stood out to me was the water wars in Bolivia, and how the union movement and organising there managed to sort of throw off the shackles of privatisation, which is obviously so deeply important to the current state of affairs here in Britain, and how we've just got gallons of shit being pumped out into our rivers, and everyone and their dog that goes anywhere near it gets diphtheria for the whole summer. And how can we use trade unionism. I keep saying unionism.
I have so many friends who say that to you, oh, you're really into unionism. I'm oh, trade unionism, maybe?
Just pissing off a solid portion of Scotland and the occupied 6 counties, my bad. Trade unionism. How can we utilise this to go beyond that simple kind of, I mean, and obviously I think those fights are so important, and we talked about it in the last episode with, you know, like how moments like the kind of like Mick Lynch phenomenon has been an incredible sort of like lightning rod for so many people to like understand the power. But I wanted to sort of go like to take stuff like the water wars and to like look at the way, maybe kind of explore a bit more of the history of particularly stuff that we're facing now, and like liberatory struggles.
I mean, the one that I always come back to with this is like, when you look at how the world is organized right now, there's a number of things which are better, which we don't think about as being down to trade unionism. Like, I didn't have to work in a factory as a child. I got to have the weekend off. You know, there are limits on how much we can work. Is like some of the very basic things that we take for granted are a result of collective struggle of working class people in the past, right? And I think sometimes we look at British history and we think that, you know, we're lucky to have the NHS. You know, we're lucky that there's some social housing. I mean, I know there's not much, but like there was a history of social housing. It's like none of this stuff was ever given to working class people. Like the NHS comes about through fear of, what a mobilised working class coming back from fighting in a war wouldn't be happy with, you know, living in squalor and not having access to healthcare. And so I think, you know, we're not told about this because it's not part of how we're taught in schools. It's not part of popular culture. And so there's a rich history we should be really proud of. But the reason we should be proud of it is to see what we could do with it today, right? Like, we don't have to put up with the NHS being trashed. We don't have to put up with these things. And I think, you know, it's deliberate that we're not taught this history, right? Like, it's part of control, you know.
Yeah.
I wonder as well, I think what I always find quite interesting, like in terms of like the contemporary moment, is the way in which a particular subset of the working class are weaponized in the culture wars, you know, and we sort of hear it time and time again. It was sort of like the white working classes of these towns that they pick, which are like not completely white, and but are like, they don't care about trans people, or they don't care about this. This is such a niche issue, and it's actually like, well, you know, I think the film Pride, you know, did incredible work to actually like insert trade unionism into a liberationary struggle. But there is a long history beyond simply the, you know, like link between Lesbians Against Portland Miners and the National Union of Miners. There's a long history of trade unionism and organised workers and organised working class being part of a liberationary struggle. And I guess that's, yeah, part of the struggle of this moment is trying to reconnect to that.
Absolutely. I think that is going to be a big struggle for the left, actually. The traditional left, often organises in small groups, often with people who agree with us, and often divided into groups with people who agree with us even more, and actually engaging in work, organising in your workplace, supporting other people to do it, means totally zooming out of that context and organising with people who might have completely different views to you, but you don't choose your colleagues at all. I mean, maybe some of us do, I don't know. For the most part, you don't choose who you work with, so you don't choose who you organise with. So you're going to be organising with people who, might have very different views from you, might have quite controversial views, but through that process, it transforms us. Engaging in that struggle with each other, we have the opportunity to debate with people and tell people they're wrong, encourage them to think other things. And through that, we start to see how we could get to a more liberatory. Is that the right word?
Yeah. You smashed it.
I was saying, I was like, I don't think that's a word. Liberatory politics. And change people's minds on that level. And I think we can, I don't have any facts or figures to back this up, but purely on a like anecdotal level, like engaging in action together, being on the picket line together, making your boss do something they don't want to do, showing you've got that power together, like really changes people's minds and their outlook on what is possible. I think if like living in this like horrible country, obviously since I was born, like really wears you down in terms of what you think is possible and our political horizon, but actually engaging in union organising, being on strike, totally, widens that horizon again, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe to add something to this, I mean, I think, I think the examples you've given are really powerful ones, right? Like, it's like a deliberate reason that, lesbians and gay support the minors like became part of that campaign, and it was about saying that these struggles need to be brought into contact with each other and people can learn from them, right? There's no kind of automatic connection there. And I think one of the things we've tried to bring out in the book is something that I think is too often lost today, that struggle is a process. And like, if we want to fight for a better world, the process through which we get there is part of building that. And so it means, like, as Lydia says, like, your colleagues might have views you really disagree with. But if we want to, as the majority, transform the world, loads of people along the way we're going to have arguments with, right? And it's about, like, how do we have those arguments in ways that bring people with us? So it means, for example, talking to your colleagues about what's happening in Palestine, talking to your colleagues about trans workers' struggles, talking to people about, like, bringing politics into the workplace as part of a kind of broader solidarity, rather than cutting ourselves off into smaller and smaller groups. And I think that's really where we see, like, some of the strengths historically of the trade union movement, of, like, bringing those bigger issues into the workplace and saying, actually, they matter. These, whether we get a pay rise matters, but also, if our work is being used to exploit and oppress people on the other side of the world, like, we should have a say. Well, we should stop it, right? Like, we shouldn't have a say over it. We should be stopping it happen. And I think it's also about seeing that, like, the way we interact with the world through our work, it's how the world gets built, right? Like, if you're, a teacher, how you teach people about previous struggles, about oppression, about exploitation, this is a part of how the next working class comes about. Or more obviously, if you're a dock worker, like, if you allow arms to be loaded, they will go and be used on people somewhere else, right? So it's about trying to think of those connections and, like, not ducking political arguments, but how we have them productively in ways that shift people, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's so much to be said about that sort of siloing effect. I think particularly of, maybe it's a little bit passé, but particularly of things like social media, which you do sort of, like, naturally build. I mean, no one really wants to spend their whole life being told they're wrong, and very few people want to spend their whole life reading shit that they don't agree with, right? You just, like, naturally, I was like, I want a quiet, nice life. What I want to see is, like, people that agree with me, and then, like, hedgehog pictures. And, like, that's about it. Maybe, like, whatever mad shit Lady Gaga's doing. Like, that's what I want my Twitter thread to look like. But, like, is that the kind of basis of a really, like, productive and revolutionary, liberatory, like, mode of transforming the world? No, it's not. And I think, in terms of sort of, like, actually, we use it quite a lot. We say, go and touch grass, right? And it is, as much as it's sort of like throwing it at people to someone that's, like, clearly needs to go the fuck outside, I think there's actually quite a lot of truth in that, right? And what you guys are saying about the way in which we don't get to, like, curate our workplace in the same way that we can a social media thing, or even the places that we get news, right? We don't get to kind of curate that and curate the space that we're in, and having those difficult conversations is so integral. I kind of wanted to also talk about how important bringing people along is in terms of, like, the biggest crises that we face, like climate, for example, right? Like, we've had a huge surge in the environmental movement in the last 5 years, and there have been a fair number of criticisms leveled at XR particularly, and various other groups, and some fairly, some unfairly. I think one of them, and I think they're definitely getting better, and there are lots of amazing groups that are doing it, is the fact that they're not talking to workers. And I wondered if we can kind of talk about how important, like, that's going to be in terms of, like, pushing us, to not drive straight off that fucking cliff. We're not going to be doing it without workers, right?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the issues, like the climate crisis. I feel most panicked and most, like, moved to action over. And it's one of the things we mention in the book, that we need power to make change, and through organising at work, we can have that power. And we probably, as the left, articulate the same argument again and again. You know, let's stop putting the onus on individuals. Let's put it on corporations, on companies who are actually polluting the planet. But then there's a missing bit in that argument. You're like, okay, and then what? Like, how are we going to make these companies do what we want them to do, right? And for me, the like really obvious, clear starting point is the place where we as workers come into direct conflict with capitalism, which is the workplace. So, you know, there are people that work at all these places, or, you know, lots of people, many of us all have jobs, and we work at places that I'm sure do things that are not good for the planet at all, and probably feel powerless to stop that. Like, I doubt your average kind of worker who works in a big corporation feels that empowered to actually make the change that that corporation needs to do in order for us all not to be like, you know, fighting each other for the last baked beans can in a few years, you know.
You can have it. I fucking hate baked beans. I'd rather starve, thanks. They're yours. But yeah, I think you're right in terms of like, we're not, yeah, we do talk a good talk. And we do need to, you know, it's really important to recognise that simply switching from having a paper cup to a chocolate cup, as much as like there is some value in that, is not going to really put a dent in it when 75% of the flights are taken by 15% of people. And like, you know, when we're looking at, and that's just within this country, let alone the differentials between the global north and the global south. So it's like, how do we organise within these corporations to start making active change? And, you know, we know, I guess, that trade unions, kind of their purpose, I guess, is to leverage and pull and take back some of the profit, right, in those pay disputes. That is essentially what's happening, is saying, well, no, you can't take this amount, like, we deserve more. And, you know, the climate crisis is a crisis of profit in many senses, right? It's simply they don't care how they get the profit, they just want profit. Trade unionism is a well-worn tool of leveraging back some of that profit, so we should utilise it. But then there's also stuff around what happens to the workers that are in the industries that we kind of all agree, like, should we be getting more oil? No. Should we be getting more coal? No. But the coal mine that just opened in Cumbria, for example, has provided jobs to a community that hasn't had them. Like, how important is it, do you think, to build union base into those communities, and how do we do that?
So I think it's incredibly important. And I think, you know, in Britain we have this, you know, like really like depressing example of what happens to communities when transitions happen and people don't have a say in it, which is like the hollowing out of communities in the north of England, right? You know, where when coal mines closed, like, other work didn't take its place. There wasn't retraining, you know, there wasn't support for many of those communities. And I think if we want like the majority of people to agree with a green transition, we have to think about like, how do the people who are currently in those industries, how are they going to be protected, and how are they going to find fulfilling, well-paid, you know, protected jobs to come out of it? And I think if, you know, most people working in these industries will look at what happened to coal mining and go, we're going to oppose this because you're going to throw our communities on the scrap heap. And so I think part of it is about like, how does transition become something that people have control over, and have a say about, not just getting rid of fossil fuels, but building the kind of communities that we want. You know, like, what does moving away from oil look like? You know, it shouldn't look like low paid service jobs being the only thing that replaces it, right? And it's also that these workers have the power, right? Like, they can turn off the gas fields and the oil fields, right? And so we have to think about how these become like popular mass struggles, rather than, you know, asking somebody to change a regulation and kick a load of people out of their work, because obviously no one's going to sign up for that, right?
And how do you think, how do we do that? Like, how do we create this popular mass struggle?
So we have one small trick.
There's one small trick doctors don't want you to know about.
If only.
But I think the reality is, you know, we don't have any shortcuts, right? And I think what we're trying to say is, like, there isn't a trick, there isn't like any magic to this. It's like people organising with each other starting in the workplace, but in communities, like there are no shortcuts. We need to start organising, and really, this is our argument in the book, right? Like, if you want to change the world, like it starts at work, and it's to try and give that excitement and that vision, right? This is why we have the examples in the book, to try and like remind us all what we can do, right?
Yeah.
And that we can win. I guess I wanted to ask about the process of writing the book, and like how, without sort of getting into the like midnight breakdowns and like,
Let's stay away from those, yeah.
like mainlining wine and stuff, like the process of sort of pulling together this kind of, Bible, I guess, to a certain extent, of like all of these different things. We talked a lot about these different examples that are like really good and like really valuable in terms of the left, in terms of proving to people that we can win, and that organising is important, and it should be at the workplace organising is important. It should be at the key of any struggle. How is the process of sort of like finding all of these? Because they're so hidden from history, and they're so sort of disparate, and particularly all of the different people within it.
Yeah, it was definitely a crowdsourced project. I think we say in the book, like, it didn't have to be us to write this book. Lots of the arguments are not novel at all, but they are arguments that have been lost in history, and at one point were incredibly important to the trade union movement. Talking about rank and file movements, the trade union bureaucracy, these are all really like tried and tested arguments, but have never been articulated in the current moment in the right way to a young audience. So it was important for us to start on that, and when collecting stories, we really spoke to, almost every trade unionist we know. We're like, okay, what are the most inspiring stories? And from that, we started with, okay, what are the arguments we hear whenever we go into a meeting with a new group of workers who want to organise? What arguments do they tell us why it's not possible? Because every group of workers will have an excuse, and often they're the same ones. So we wrote down a list of like 5 of these excuses. People saying, we're too precarious. We're too divided, we're too precarious. Okay, we're like, great, we've got about 500 examples of where people said the same and went on to amazing victories. And then people saying, oh, we're not precarious enough. We're too cushy, we have lovely jobs, white collar jobs. And we're like, all right, also got a million examples of why you should still organise. And the list really went on from there, didn't it? As a kind of debunking mission. I think we've both been in so many of these meetings where people are like, no, we're so special, we can't do it. We're like, you're not special. Like literally, I'm not like other workers. And we're like, yes, you are.
But I mean, we have this joke that we often say is like, as Lydia says, you go into meetings with people and they say, it works for them, but like, we're unique. It's like everyone's unique. Like everyone has a reason and a history, right? And I think, we start the book off with a little bit of our own personal histories, being a Stop the War kid, doing Palestine stuff, then getting involved in union organising. And we say this because, the details in the book isn't just like, it obviously is a book about why you should organise, but it's also like the resources that we've both used in our organising across lots of different unions, social movements of like, for many people who are organising today at work, and a lot of the people we speak to, like, haven't been part of those other movements. I often joke that, like, if you're around the left long enough, you end up with, like, trade union aunties and uncles who are like, this one campaign from 1980s has the perfect art. You have this access to, like, a living archive of struggles people have been through, that if you're a young worker today, or you're a worker who's new to organising, like, you don't have a phone book of people you can be like, this issue's come up and I don't know how to deal with it. And so for us, it was like, can we take some of these wonderful, inspiring, like, powerful stories and use them in the book so that then hopefully someone else goes, yeah, well, you think you're too precarious? Well, we've got a story for you that can help you take those first steps, right?
Yeah, and I think for me, the most important bit is, obviously the stories are amazing, but to create a set of principles through which socialists can engage with worker organising. it's amazing to see this like huge rush of people joining unions, getting involved. But I always bring myself back to the point that like the BNP, the British National Party, have a union. Like, you know, there are right-wing unions that exist. Like being in a union and collective action is not necessarily a left-wing thing, or by its very nature is not a radical thing. And when we engage with union organising, we have to have this really sharp analysis of unions, how they function, how the workplace functions, in order to engage in it in a way that not only wins, but also creates the agent, the people, you know, the leaders who can then go on to lead amazing socialist movements, I think.
And how do we ensure that we don't like miss this moment in terms of like union struggle and this sort of resurgence that we've not seen, I don't think, like in my lifetime certainly. And that rush of people to join, every time Mick Lynch goes on Sky News, it's like TUC website like goes down because people are like, fuck yeah, I'll have some of that. But how do we make sure that we don't lose those people and that they don't sort of become dormant and just sort of paying subs into the union machine, or that they sort of get sucked up into faff or like factional fighting? Like, how is it that we can like best utilize this moment?
I think for us, and this is one of the things we really try and emphasize, is the importance has to be on rank and file organizing in a union. So for anyone who might not know what that is, it's the the real base of the union, the average member organizing with other members in order to push the leadership often, or push in the workplace as well. So we should be obviously doing that organising in the workplace, but also be creating those networks within our unions too. I'm not talking about some major faction fighting or anything like that, please, God, no. But creating those rank and file networks to, when this moment blows over and the union bureaucracies, the leaders of the unions, are not feeling as much pressure to call strikes over the cost of living crisis, we still have that lever to force strike action and to make action happen within our unions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. The debate has moved on, I think, for a lot of people. It used to be, you'd see it on Twitter all the time, right? Like, join a union. Like, join a union and that's enough, right?
General strike.
Let's
have a general strike tomorrow.
Oh, mate, the number of fucking demos I've been on and all I've had general strike. It's just like, bro, how?
Love it. Would love one, but
it's always.
Let's get back to reality.
Maybe it's when I was a kid. It's when I was like when it was always students, and I'm like, sir, like, we're all on general strike anyway. We we literally watch fucking Bargain Hunt instead of going to our lectures.
But I think there's going to, this period is going to have like a lot of lesson learning for people because, we had the hot strike summer, right? We had the biggest strike wave in our lifetimes. And then, we're now getting loads of unions basically taking shit deals, right? Like below inflation deals. And I think there's a bit of a question of like, why does this happen? And for us in the book, as Lydia says, it's about like, why do unions do things that aren't in their members' interests, right? And it's about, unions end up, as they grow and they get bigger, they end up with a bureaucracy who spend more time meeting managers, often being paid a lot more than we are, and get pulled by those pressures, which is not then to have a whole load of people go, well, unions are a waste of time. It's that we have to fight in our union to make our unions do, to call these strikes, to fight for something more. But it means that being sold out is like part of the process, right? And it's like, how do we deal with that? Like, how do we, as the RCN have shown, like, how do you turn back a deal that's not good enough? Or in UCU, something similar has happened. Is like not to let those turn people off mass union organising campaigns, and instead to see that, we have the potential to do something so much more. And so part of the book is also about like what does it mean to be a socialist in a trade union? Like the focus on taking action, that democracy isn't like window dressing, right? It's like a part of the struggle, but also like what a mass popular politics from below means and looks like in practice. And that will have ups and downs, right? like maybe we win this huge dispute nationally in every workplace. Like I would love to hope so, and we should be fighting for it. But if we have setbacks, it's like, what do we learn from that for next time round when we have strike waves?
And how do we, because I sort of, my first big thing where I cut my teeth was the student demos, right? The uprising in 2010. And obviously we had this explosion, and it was really fun and exciting and cool, and we were all playing cat and mouse with the cops, and then it was less cool, and we were getting charged up with horses, and then it was very cold for a very long time on that fucking bridge. And then we lost, and it was oh, right? And it was just sort of this explosion of young people being we're gonna fuck shit up. And then we lost, and that movement sort of dissipated. And a lot of people felt very burnt out. And, I think in truth, and I've seen it sort of over and over again with the campaign against the policing act, for example, right? Kill the Bill was this incredible explosion, which people like Sisters Uncut, for example, did amazing organizing work. But I remember talking to them because I was covering it, and I know lots of them, talking to them, and they were sort of we're not going to stop this piece of legislation passing. We're not stupid. We can read the numbers. This is how it's going to happen. It's about creating this movement and then going and organizing more. But was that message taken by all of the people that went to those demos? I'm not so sure. Same with the student movement. How do we make sure people understand that your union's just delivered a really shit deal and they've just signed it up? Do not be dissuaded. How do we reach those people?
I mean, if I can say one thing on the student movement stuff, we lost, but you and I are still doing stuff, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And the labour movement is full of people who went through the student movement, hopefully learned some really important lessons. Some better.
When to duck.
Yeah. When to run down that side street. But if you look at some of these public sector disputes, I see loads of people I knew from the student movement who are now branch secretaries, who have been fighting casualisation in universities. Those experiences, they don't disappear, but I think part of what we need to be better at is how do we keep those things going and move that energy into other places? Yeah.
I think maybe it was a little bit before my time, the 2010 student movement, but I also kind of came to politics at a time when we were occupying, we were doing every single demo, we were there, we were solid activists. But we always had this feeling fundamentally we were powerless. I know we have those really exciting moments where we're fighting the cops and we're yeah, we can make a resolute revolution happen.
Build the barricades.
But then we come away from them, we're have we actually tipped the balance of power in a serious way? Probably not. An A to B march through central London doesn't really tip the balance of power that much. But then when I kind of first got involved in unions and actually started organising on strikes and picket lines and saw that we could actually force our opponents to do something they did not want to do. And that was a really novel experience. And that's a really sad thing to admit, that after years of organising and campaigning, through small activist groups, it took me years to get to the moment where I actually felt we could force our opponents to do something they did not want to do. And that was the moment where I was okay, this is it. We all need to be organising in our unions, because when we withdraw our labour through a strike or when we take other kinds of action at work, we can force our employers to do things. We do have power. And I think that's the lesson that I want everyone to come away with and to experiment with in their own workplace. If you're feeling politically hopeless, if you engaged in the Corbyn or the Bernie movement and feel that was this only avenue for change, maybe knocking on some doors and ticking a box on a ballot sheet, you can create power in your workplace, and there is no limit to what you can demand if we have enough power, I think. Let's be hopeful. Fuck yeah.